Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. David Rivera, a national advisor to the Steve Fund and an associate professor of counseling at Queens College, City University of New York. Welcome to today's program, Race, Gender Identity, and Sexual Orientation, Healing and Wellbeing for Young People of Color, a Steve Fund community conversation. I'm so glad to be here with you today, especially during Pride Month, to explore this important topic and have some conversation with you all. The Steve Fund is a national organization dedicated to the mental health and emotional well-being of young people of color and works in partnerships with leaders in higher education, the corporate sector, and other workplace environments, nonprofits, and with community partners to promote the mental health and well-being of young people of color. Our series, Community Conversations, is open and free to the public and an opportunity to meet with mental health specialists, researchers, and leaders of color to learn about and discuss timely topics and to build community so we can together support and promote the mental health and emotional well-being of our young people. I also want to take this time to acknowledge that I'm calling in from Hawaii and recognize and honor the people indigenous to Hawaii whose lands were stolen, and that freedom for indigenous people will not be fully actualized until their lands are rightfully and completely restored back to their care. Today's event will run for 1 hour. We invite you to share your thoughts, experiences, and responses throughout our 1 hour together in the chat. Be aware that today's event is being recorded and that we may share it in full or in part with others who could not make the time today. And if you have a comment or question but wish it to remain anonymous, please feel free to private chat Steve Fund producer directly. Our producer, Sarah, is monitoring the private chat and will share your questions or comments with me anonymously as time allows. Please note that this is our goal to create a brave and safe space so that we can please keep your participation and chatting respectful. Again, we're so glad you're here. Let's get started. At the end of today's conversation, we are hoping that you will be able to describe the impact of trauma on LGBTQ+ youth of color, describe affirming approaches to support LGBTQ+ youth of color, and describe strengths and assets of LGBTQ+ youth of color. And I'm glad to see that folks are already utilizing the chat. Please introduce where you're calling from. It's great to see folks calling from all over the country and probably beyond. Joining me today are two wonderful colleagues, two of my favorite people who are experts on race, gender identity, and sexual orientation and mental health for young people of color. We have Dr. Nadine Nakamura, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Laverne, and Dr. Daniel K. Phillip, founder and licensed clinical psychologist at Together and Through. Welcome to you both, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us here today. Let's see, we can unmute everyone. We can see their beautiful faces join us. All right. So as we begin, we want to talk a bit about how the unique intersections of race, sexuality, and gender lead to specific mental health and wellness issues and impacts on LGBTQ+ youth of color. So I want to start off by asking you both, what do you see and what do we know about these communities and mental health? And as you share your responses, please feel free to share personal anecdotes or stories, and I welcome that. So Dr. Phillip, as a clinician and practitioner, you work directly with young people who are BIPOC and transgender and non-binary. I'm hoping that you can talk about some of the challenges these young people have in seeking and accessing the mental health care they need.
Thank you for the warm introduction, Dave. So I want to start by saying that I would like to plainly state that the challenges that queer young people of color face are a result of the hindrances that are beyond their control, oftentimes created by the systems and institutions in which they function. So that is my opening statement. So I want to zoom out a bit and provide some more context. And looking at our current context, we have what we know the devastating impact of COVID-19 on marginalized communities. We have anti-trans bills that seem to be popping up weekly. We have racialized and state-sanctioned violence. We even have the recent discovery of additional mass graves of Native American children, and the list continues. Now, couple these with the ongoing realities of housing insecurity, healthcare inaccessibility, and limited financial resources, which exist because of racism, sexism, classism, and queerphobia. With all of this, we can only just begin to understand the reality of many young queer folk of color in this country who are simply trying to survive long enough to move from emerging adulthood to early adulthood and beyond. And we know that the terms for experiencing these various isms is called multiple minority stress, and our younger queer folks of color are in the thick of it. Again, they're responding to various forms of discrimination and stigma, all while trying to establish themselves as adults. So we know from research that mental health implications of multiple minority stress is limited, but we could make a few educated guesses based on what we do know about health disparity data for LGBT individuals, which leads to increased levels of depression, anxiety, substance use and misuse, and then separately from health disparity data around people of color, which again, similar concerns, and then we add additional mental health concerns. Now try to imagine what it looks like if you happen to be an LGBTQ person of color. But we know in spite of these realities, young queer folk are still showing up ready to ask pointed questions of us as mental health clinicians. I want to share this story that actually strangely happened recently, where as a clinician, part of my practice is when folks reach out to me for services, I want to establish like an initial consultation where I get to know them and allow them to ask me questions that they would not have answers to based on my web presence. And after I gave my spiel about who I am and a little bit about my background, this person asked me point blank, what is your understanding of race, particularly Blackness, within queer Latinx communities? And why do you work with these communities? And I honestly appreciate these types of questions because regardless of my lived experiences, it holds me accountable to do my own work so I can answer these questions truthfully. But when we haven't done our work to provide genuine and nuanced answers, we unintentionally create barriers for these communities who then see us as inaccessible, right? So accessibility, I want to start by saying accessibility isn't only about getting to us, but connecting with us, trusting us, and ultimately working and healing with us. When I do ask prospective questions, why they reached out to me specifically, the answers remain consistent. Clients are seeking providers who look like them and may have some lived experience. And yes, again, the research shows that for some folks, the therapist's identities may not matter. But what we do know is that there's a phenomenon called cultural mistrust, which is an arguably protective and adaptive response to surviving centuries of targeted violence by dominant groups. It's real and should be included as an influential factor when engaging in these discussions about barriers and challenges. Now, I think one way to address the specific concern of cultural mistrust is to ask those of us who support these communities to look at the composition of our teams or staff, right? Do they reflect the communities with which you work? If not, ask yourself why this discrepancy exists and acknowledge that this is an identifiable and fixable barrier to care. I'm thinking about my experience of working as a staff psychologist in a university counseling center and observed the emotional labor that one of my colleagues, the lone Black woman on staff, experienced when Black women and Black femmes sought her for care. See, our systems our care systems seem to be creating additional challenges for younger queer folks of color by not hiring and retaining staff who look like them and could help shape policies with their unique concerns in mind.
Dr. Phillip, thank you so much for dropping so much knowledge on us, for taking the longer view, the more holistic view of what's really going on contextually, right, systemically, that's impacting the mental health well-being of young queer people of color, and also going into what access really means. It's not just providing the service, but we have to provide the service in a culturally competent, affirming way. And then talking about cultural mistrust, one of those huge barriers that is kind of hindering and kind of preventing folks often from kind of seeking out that support, and also just sharing your experiences of what you do to create that affirming environment for you and your clients. Thanks so much. You know, we also want participants to kind of participate in the chat with specific questions. And one of the questions we'd like you to put in there is, what have you observed or experienced around mental health and wellness over the year from your own experiences? So feel free to plop those in the chats and we can kind of see what's been going on for folks more globally speaking. Dr. Nakamura, I want to turn it over to you. You work primarily with grad students, including international students, and have looked closely at their experiences. Actually contributing a chapter to a recent book I've edited that will be coming out at the end of the year, Affirming LGBTQ plus Students in Higher Education. This is not a plug for the book in terms of buying it, but just how we are utilizing Dr. Nakamura's immense expertise So Dr. Nakamura, what are these graduate students experiencing in terms of mental health and well-being, and what contributes to these experiences?
Well, thank you for the question. I had actually forgotten all about the book and the book chapter until I saw the question, and then I was reminded, oh yeah, I should go read that. What is it that I have to say about this question? And I think that, a big thing for us to keep in mind is issues around isolation. So, thinking about particularly right now with the global pandemic, how even more isolated LGBTQ international students are than they ordinarily are. That makes me think of another point, which is thinking about all of the barriers and challenges that have existed for LGBTQ students of color, people of color, under ordinary circumstances. And then you think about the past 16 months as this additional layer, this additional stressor that we all are collectively experiencing, but this is on top of what folks have been carrying for a really long time. So, just thinking about what's the threshold? How much do we expect that people can actually carry? So for LGBTQ international students, I think that issue of isolation is just so much more exacerbated. Being able to connect and form community is challenging in a new country. And when you're trying to do that on Zoom with, classmates that you haven't met in person, trying to navigate a new culture and make connections, from your living room, that's a really big challenge. And so we have to be thinking about, what can we be doing to help, acclimate people, help people feel connected, that is just so important. I think for graduate students more generally, some of the challenges that they're facing is related to the multiple roles that they're carrying, right? So they are students, but in a lot of cases they might be TAs, they might be teaching classes themselves, they might be trainees, in my area, seeing clients, and so doing a lot of caretaking, and then thinking about who's taking care of them or who's reminding them to take care of themselves, and do they have good models in the faculty and staff that they are, interacting with, that's giving them the signals that you should be taking care of yourself? Or are we somehow sending the signal that that's something that means that you're not cut out for this field? If you're struggling right now, it's because you don't care enough, or you're not working hard enough. So I think there's a lot of things, Dr. Phillip said so much that I think also applies to students. What are all of these, barriers that exist that are really making it more challenging for LGBTQ students of color during these times, especially, but recognizing that these are things that have also existed for them, long before COVID, and will persist beyond COVID as well. So as we start to get back to normal, what is normal? Was normal that great to begin with? And what can we do to make it better for those folks?
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Nakamura, for helping to kind of create a more nuanced picture of what graduate students of color who are also queer or trans are experiencing. What we're doing is helping to also break that myth of, a monolithic community, right? We are communities, we are many communities, right? We have connections with each other, but there are also very unique experiences that we all have as queer people of color, depending on our social context, our social location, and the strengths and assets that we can acknowledge and use to kind of advance ourselves forward. And that idea of self-care, right? Especially for grad students who might have additional pressures and might be seen as more a worker as opposed to a student, and might have those pressures of having to kind of feel like they have to put on that face to keep things together, which we know just kind of keeps the pressure cooker brewing, right? And those issues aren't able to kind of be processed. So, the accumulation of trauma is really important to acknowledge. I think what we're doing in this community conversation is also offering a lot of consciousness raising, where we're offering language to kind of make sense of these experiences, which is in and of itself an intervention that we can use towards healing. Dr. Nakamura, I also want to ask you another question. You've looked closely at the institutional barriers and challenges for students of higher ed, and you kind of mentioned some already. What do you see, and what can institutions do better systemically in terms of policy and practice to support these students? Especially as we emerge from COVID and return to in-person. You kind of already said that we can actually take advantage of this as a reset and not return to the horrible normal that we had before, right? We shouldn't act like everything was just rosy and peachy, right? It was actually pretty oppressive, right? Just got highlighted even more so during this pandemic.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think, just thinking about what the culture around mental health is at our institutions, thinking about how grind culture is really a huge part of academia, that it is in a lot of ways celebrated, how much, how long did you stay awake to turn in that paper, that we really don't promote health and well-being. We don't promote long-term health and well-being. It's very much for the immediate fix of, study all night or write all night or, what have you, turn that grant in. And, I think students see their faculty members, they see their staff working themselves to the bone. And so it's a larger systemic issue. It's not necessarily, that these are bad people who are modeling this behavior because, they enjoy it. In a lot of ways, they're being encouraged to do that as well. And so just thinking about the whole picture and thinking about, the trickle down effect of, these expectations on faculty and staff, and how this is really promoting a lot of unhealthy behavior, I think, for students, that this is what it's supposed to be like. Do you see or do you hear faculty and staff talking about taking time off, about resting, about, what they do to take care of themselves? Or do you just hear about, are you getting emails responded to at 2 o'clock in the morning? That's sending a message that we're supposed to be working around the clock. And so I think that as we try to intervene on behalf of mental health for students, we have to think about, is the system really reflecting that we care about that we want that? Or are we just saying it because it sounds right, because we have to, because, we're concerned about things like suicidality among students. And so we have to say, that we want you to be healthy and take care of yourself. But I think we need to do more than say this. We need to be promoting a culture where everyone is engaging in this kind of, holistic care, thinking about themselves as full human beings, thinking about themselves as, having so much to bring to the table, so, what are the things that also we are kind of acculturating students or encouraging them to assimilate to this system, when I think we would benefit so much if we allowed students and faculty and staff to show up, as they are, as full humans, with all the diversity that they can offer. There's so much creativity there. There's so much wisdom there, and in a lot of ways we encourage people to leave that at the door. That's not professional, and so I think we're really robbing ourselves in a lot of ways as institutions of higher education, because we're doing this. And I think I like what you said about the intervention, because I don't think people recognize that is what we're doing. That we are kind of colluding in this way of being that's really depriving all of us.
You can say that many more times, much more loudly. We need to hear this resonate throughout the entire system of higher ed. That is extremely oppressive. And this idea that, academicians, higher educators, they can talk really well, right? So we can talk the talk, but are they actually walking the walk, right? Are they actually doing it? Are they expressing it? So we can be saying, take care of yourself, but then if we're in the same voice saying, but you have a 2 a.m. deadline and I need you to meet it, what's going on there? So we should internally assess the contradictions that we might be actually living out that might actually be doing harm unintentionally, but still doing harm, right? So the intention doesn't even matter. I want to mention, in the chat, Patricia says that she is seeing more conversations around mental health and wellness and more openness. And I think that's actually one of the reframes I've been using as well that has come about over this past 15, 16, who knows, how long has this pandemic been going on now? I've lost count. But one thing is that there have been more overt conversations about these issues, which is great. And I think we need to celebrate that and kind of utilize, the wave that's been created and kind of ride that out as fully as possible. Dr. Phillip, I want to kind of turn it to kind of the medical community and think about what are some things that our medical community and healthcare systems need to do to address I know the well-being issues that young people of color, especially young queer people of color and young young trans people of color have as we emerge from COVID and live through this fraught racial climate in America.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Dr. Rivera. So, you know, I want to say, like, understandably so, our healthcare system has been overwhelmed since the emergence of COVID-19. And I would argue to say that the system has been overwhelmed prior to COVID-19, right? So understandably so, non-COVID-19 related procedures were indefinitely postponed at the beginning and throughout the pandemic. But as we slowly resume these services, I think we need to be a lot more intentional in understanding the impact of postponing things like gender affirming procedures among these communities, right? So I want folks to sit and think about the queer folks of color who live in states that, for example, require a medical procedure to be completed in order to gain access to a gender marker change. That gender marker change could be the thing that prevents you or protects you from housing or employment discrimination, right? And if you're a queer person of color, you're navigating not just racism, but cissexism and or queerphobia. So again, I tend to think about things very much systemically, right? So I really think that until the laws and policies change, we have to figure out strategically how to prioritize providing services to these historically neglected communities who are already the last to receive dedicated resources and aid during crises. So the first consideration is, how do we alter our practice that elevates these folks' experiences and voices? Thinking about the healthcare system, I also think we need to get creative about how we are accessing these communities and where we provide services as a good start to this conversation. So as I mentioned in my formal role in college counseling, I partnered with student-facing offices to support initiatives that literally met young people where they physically were, right? Because sometimes we know that the physical location can also prove to be a barrier for marginalized communities. I think we also need to expand our definition of what providing care looks like to include programs that focus on more primary interventions or preventative services for these communities. And I think also as healthcare providers who work with these communities, we have to be their biggest accomplices and advocates, right? There's so many opportunities for advocacy, whether it's challenging these ridiculous anti-trans bills or speaking with representatives about supporting telehealth bills, which, believe it or not, there's some controversy around, should we continue telehealth? And I'm thinking accessibility, it has made it a lot more easy for example, a lot of my clients who may not be out in their larger communities to have the privacy in their room to meet with me and to feel affirmed in that space. And that in itself is an intervention, right? And I also want healthcare systems to think about what it would look like to include community members in some of their organizational boards. I find it really strange when larger medical systems are embedded in these communities and don't actually listen to the needs of the folks who live and work in these communities. That to me is a huge selling point of why our system needs to change. Because I think until we have to keep pushing these systems with our clients, not for our clients, but ultimately the system adapts and actually responds to the need versus us assuming that we know what's happening in these communities. Because again, regardless of my lived experience, my experience is going to be different from every single client that I meet, and I have to be attentive to what that person is coming in to discuss, and the system overall has to also adapt to the needs of our clients.
Dr. Phillip, thank you so much. There's a couple things I want to kind of ask you up as follow-up for both you and Dr. Nakamura, but I also want to just acknowledge, you know, the systemic needs that you mentioned, and how, you know, if we're seeing a provider or a system and we don't see that they have a community board, maybe one thing we can do as an ally or an accomplice is voice and say, well, where's the community's voice here, right? How are we going to know what the needs are if we're not asking folks directly what their needs are? So institutions and systems need to also act culturally humble, just as clinicians need to, in terms of understanding the needs of their and worldviews of their clients before we actually offer services. So we can be doing it in the most affirming way possible. So let's talk about this idea of accomplice and allyship. Elliot mentioned in the chat that noticed that a lot of students are more vocal about, intensely experiencing impacts of, patriarchal hegemony and toxic masculinity, for example. And I'm wondering from an accomplice or ally perspective, what we can do to support folks who are, and I think across the board, regardless of gender, everyone is a victim of patriarchy, right? We know this, but we know that some people are more in particular are kind of fall into the oppressive traps of patriarchy and what have you. So what can we do as accomplices to support students in this way? And maybe even define, Dr. Phillip, what's meant by accomplice or ally.
Yeah, that is a good starting point, right? So I tend to shy away from the term ally because I think, especially with queer circles, ally has become an identity. And I want to hit the brakes and say it's not an identity, it's a role that you serve, right? Mm-hmm. I think of someone being an accomplice as something that's a lot more active. An accomplice sees what's happening and you don't just offer an affirmative response, but you partner with that person and you don't step in front of them, you step with them. How can I support you as you get to the goal that you need to achieve, right? So that for me is the biggest distinction between accomplice and an ally. In terms of how do we embody what it means to be an accomplice, it is simple things like naming what you are seeing in the system and asking those tough questions. And I know that in my talking pieces thus far, I've focused on larger systemic change, but I also want folks to understand that change can be incremental and small. So a change for me with a client is being able to answer those questions truthfully. Why do you work with these communities, right? Because again, going back to the first piece around cultural mistrust, I don't hear that question as a challenge. I hear that as, are you going to be an accomplice with me on this journey? Because I need to understand what your investment in me and my community is, right? So the first thing is listening and naming when things are happening and being, I think, a work in progress to realize when you have your own biases and when you still have your own areas of improvement to work on. And then in terms of another major piece around being an accomplice is being consistent. I think consistency is super important. It's not okay if we are on the front lines for one issue and not others. We're talking specifically about young queer folks of color, but we also know that young queer folks of color come with their own lenses around, are they a citizen of this country? What is their indigenous roots? Are there certain disabilities? Like all of this is connected. So I think as accomplices, we have to be consistent in naming all of the experiences of students while honoring their humanity. And this particular intersection around queerness and race should, in our conversation, is to highlight, but it's one of the things that I think working with students and young people, those are the two things that are really under fire in this moment.
Thanks so much for breaking down what is meant by accomplice. I really appreciated that definition so much. Dr. Nakamura.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Sorry, there's airplanes flying overhead, so hopefully it's not too noisy. But I wanted to say to the point about being an accomplice is that I think it's really important for us to recognize that we should not try to show up with all the answers. And I think that's really hard in academia. It's really hard for people in those spaces to not feel like that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to come up with a solution. And so for faculty and staff, to be accomplices to students, I think a lot of it boils down to listening to students and to acknowledging that none of us are perfect. None of us know all the answers. None of us are, to kind of break away from this desire, I think, to be the savior. I think that that's a really tough one for people when it comes to playing this role, that, there's a lot of internal pressure of wanting to make everything okay, but recognizing that this is part of a larger system and that no one person can make all of that go away and make that okay. So maybe taking some of that pressure off of us individually will help us to be better actors and to recognize that this is a long-term investment, that we don't get to just show up, for 3 hours, do our thing, and then we're good, but that, we have to keep showing up and that the system is going to fight back, is going to resist change. The system is the system for a reason. It's working and serving a particular purpose that a lot of people are comfortable with. And so, when students are banging on the desk and asking for things to be different, a lot of people take that very personally, or are afraid of that. And I think that, we do a really good job teaching students to think critically about other things, about other systems, about other oppressors. And when they then say, well, what about right here? I think a lot of times we get really upset with them for doing that. So they get a really mixed message about being agents of social change. So we really need to reflect on that and, question what kind of psychological harm might we be doing when we are engaging them in this way, teaching them on an intellectual level, but then kind of perhaps emotionally punishing them or retaliating against them when it gets too close to home.
Thank you both so much for sharing. I know a lot of really practical things that folks can do. I find that when people are showing up for other people as accomplices, or maybe they are using the old frame as allies, that if they're not checking in with themselves, understanding their limits and not being consistent, that's going to fall into the trappings of performativity, right? Which we know is hollow, right? We know that that doesn't really lead to any kind of sustaining change, and people can see through it as well. And so I think there's no shame in knowing what your limits are, right? Especially if you're showing up for communities that maybe you don't belong to or you don't identify directly with, but you want to be an accomplice with, is that understanding what our limits are, especially from knowledge and from skills. And then we utilize that to kind of dictate, well, what can I do within my current scope of limits that I have, or my current scope of abilities. So thank you both for sharing some very practical knowledge for what folks can really do to avoid performativity. We've been talking a lot about what institutions and communities can do, and some of the systemic issues that impact the mental health and well-being of these populations. Let's also consider wellness, from a multidimensional perspective. Some folks in the chat have been talking about self-care and what have you. And I think it's important that we conceptualize wellness very holistically, so we can understand what self-care can look like as we promote, the various vectors of our wellness. So from a multidimensional perspective, there are many, wellness perspectives out there. Oftentimes they take an 8-vector perspective to include, emotional, psychological, our physical wellness, spiritual wellness. That doesn't necessarily mean religion, but really means, a connection to something other than yourself. It could be a higher being. It could be the world around you. It could be the community that you belong to. Social wellness, environmental wellness, right? The world, how are we caring for the world around us, right? Especially as this world is fighting back against us and telling us, in very many meaningful ways that we're not doing our job in preserving and protecting the earth that we rely on. Our personal wellness, the goals that we have set out for ourselves, how are we optimizing them? How are we reaching them? And then intellectual wellness, how are we kind of taking care of our cognitive abilities and our pursuits and our creativity? So considering these areas of wellness, what are some things students and families can do to promote healing and wellness individually and to support themselves and their family members? And Dr. Nakamura, you can start us out.
Well, I think a great place to start is getting comfortable with boundaries. That's something that many of us have been taught kind of the opposite. To be generous to a fault, to, help everyone, to let everyone in, to, just to kind of keep making space for everyone but yourself. And so I think learning that, self-care is not selfish, that you have to preserve something, not let the tank completely run empty. I've heard people make the analogy with your phone, like you wouldn't let your phone get to 3% and keep walking around with it, like you recharge it. And so, but we don't treat ourselves that way. So I think that, really starting to think about, if I care about things, if I feel passionate, if I want to make a change, what can I do to sustain myself for the long term? That running myself into the ground and being another person on the side of the road who now needs an intervention, like really isn't helping the bigger cause. And so resting is just so important. And I think many of us have been shamed into doing that, shamed into not doing that, I should say, feeling like we have to keep pushing if we really care about something. So I think that, starting there of just thinking, how can I rejuvenate myself? And if it has to be for the bigger cause, then if that's the frame that you need to be able to engage in this, then I think that works, to think about, how do I serve my community? How do I serve my family or whoever is in my life that I care about if I am completely depleted? And then I think that, going beyond students and kind of taking it outwards, I think the people who then support students also need to be doing this for themselves, because then we can be, mentally well. And so that we can, take in whatever it is that people are bringing to us, because we are in a healthy state. But when we too are depleted, we too, have ignored our boundaries, have worked through the weekend, the whole semester, then, we are not in a good space, and we won't be able to play the role of being an accomplice, because we're now all messed up and wounded and have all of these needs that, are not met. And so then we're not able to, I think, show up and, be in a space where we can have the right kind of relationship with students, so that it's all, it's very much kind of this personal thing, but then it goes out, I think, into the larger system as well. So if we could all just kind of, calm down a little bit, take some time, breathe, taking 2 minutes to breathe before you go into the next thing, that you deserve that. And if we can all kind of be engaging in this together, I think we'll be in a slightly better place to carry on with the work.
Yes, definitely. As my good friend, Dr. Sherry Malik put in the chat, we need to put on our oxygen mask first. If we're not breathing in oxygen, if we're not supplying our bodies with its nourishment, right, and its holistic nourishment that it needs, we're not going to be able to be our full selves to be there for our communities. Dr. Phillip.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to say this as a psychologist who is part of the system, right? I firmly believe that exploring health support outside of the medical system is one of the only ways to survive, right? Because here's the unspoken power of young queer folk of color. We've always been creative in establishing systems of care. And I see these systems in the form of chosen family, identity-based fraternities and sororities, houses and ballroom culture, places of worship, even in the club is considered a form of health support, right? I think the healthcare system is one way of accessing healing, but I think these other forms of community are equally powerful and formative and become protective factors against some of the mental health concerns that these communities face. I also want to, on an earlier point, we mentioned like we think about our students having multiple roles. I think you, Dr. Nakamura, shared that piece that they're students, they're on these boards, they're on these committees. And we need to also start thinking as a form of health of compensating these folks appropriately for their labor, right? The United States has such a rich history of student activism that I think it's time that we adequately compensate folks for their labor. And for some folks, compensation doesn't necessarily have to mean let's pay you a stipend or an honorarium. That's one way, but we have to get creative about thinking about health as not just existing within capitalism, although I will say money is important for many of these communities. But I think we need to think about compensation as like, let me see what your need is and if I have the skills and resources to meet some of these needs.
Oof, you just laid out so many assets, right, that queer folks and trans folks and non-binary folks have been relying on and fostering for who knows how long, right? And that we need to celebrate that, right? I really want to celebrate the asset-based direction that we're taking this conversation to. You know, when conversations are had about populations that have been historically oppressed, it often focuses on, you know, the negative, you know, the pathology and what have you, which we need to address. That's important. If we don't know what the issues are, we're not going to know how or what to do to address the issues. But one of the ways that we do address things, and this goes for everyone, is that we rely on our strengths, right? We rely on the assets that we have to kind of propel us forward, to move us and to help us kind of overcome the challenges that we're kind of encountering on a daily basis. You know, this is what we need to see, understand, and name during these conversations, these strengths. And I encourage everyone out there to do, you know, very overt strengths kind of appraisals of yourself. What are your strengths? Do this on a daily basis, right? If you don't know what your strengths are, you're not going to know how to put them in place when you need them. So it's important that we do a continuous kind of overview of what our strengths are. You know, I want in the chat, you all are utilizing it extremely well. We can probably make a book out of this chat from my perspective. But what are you all, everyone on this call, what are you kind of experiencing in terms of what has felt affirming for your gender identity and for your sexual orientation on your campus, in your workplace, or in your community? What is working for you? You know, I think as we shared these stories, you know, we're creating dialogue. We're helping to also shift the narrative, right, to one that is more assets and strengths based. And one way that we do this is by communicating with each other, right? That's the only way that we change narrative. So please utilize the chat to help share and learn from one another. You know, again, additional, you know, we need to recognize, understand, and celebrate these strengths, as I mentioned. And I recommend that we all do this on a regular basis. You know, we need to kind of actualize radical self-care. I've been hearing a lot of that through what Doctors Nakamura and Phillip has said. You know, just by taking care of ourselves can be an act of defiance against oppression, and that we need to do that. You know, oppressors don't want us to do that. So we have to kind of do that in light of that and in spite of that. Now, I want to take some questions from the chat. We have about 20 minutes left, and we have a few things going on here. You know, I think one comment from Carrie sees kind of a disconnect between faculty and students. And I know that Dr. Nakamura spent a lot of time kind of highlighting some of those disconnects that you've experienced between students that can lead, you know, to just further oppressions and further harm. So maybe we can break this down a bit more, because I know something that I'm commonly asked, especially from students that I work with, is, well, yeah, I see when my professor does, you know, commits a microaggression or kind of leaves me out unintentionally, but who knows if it's unintentional. But given the, you know, the hierarchy, right? Extreme hierarchy in academia, positions of power, you know, a professor holds, you know, the grades in their hands, which are going to be used for maybe future, you know, graduate studies or even employers or what have you. And so there's real meaningful kind of costs that we might bear when we kind of address these issues. There's this catch-22. I'm wondering if both, you know, Dr. Nakamura and Dr. Phillip, you know, you both have been in academia for quite some time, just getting your degrees. And I'm wondering from your perspectives, both experientially and also from your perspectives in your current positions, what can students do and how can they kind of address these issues in the classroom and with folks that may appear to be kind of hierarchically above them?
Oh, that's such a tough one. I think the expectation is that students, you know, be direct. You know, the expectations are that students, you know, go to their professor and tell their professor, hey, you committed a microaggression against me, and that felt really bad. And not recognizing what that's setting the student up for, what potential harm can come to the student from doing that. That there's a pretty good chance that the student will be met with excuses or taking care of the person that they have now informed about the microaggression and are not going to be getting their needs met from that encounter and exchange. So I think that, you know, part of it is for, you know, people who are in positions of power, ideally are able to reflect and recognize the power that they hold and can, you know, perhaps bring that up in conversation in the classroom, can acknowledge, you know, sometimes I might misspeak, and, you know, it's, you know, I welcome people to give me feedback and actually mean it. If you don't want that feedback, then think about, well, then, you know, what am I going to do then? And, you know, also thinking about from the student's perspective, ideally having a community, you know, ideally having other people, you know, and then maybe that community is not in your department. I mean, I think unfortunately that's often the case, is that you are the only one. You know, they don't often let many of us get together in a group, whether that's faculty or students, that, you know, just kind of by circumstance, there's always just a few of us. And, you know, there's that strengths in numbers challenge that often we don't have that. And so what I often try to do is connect students outside of my department or even my university to other organizations, you know, professional organizations, other student groups, you know, as a way to, you know, connect, you know, and I think that's how we all met a long time ago, you know, by forming those kinds of relationships outside of your institution. and that can be a place where you get support, that you can run a scenario by somebody, or even just have somebody say, yeah, that's really messed up, that happened to me too, helps you to feel like, oh, it's not just me. Oh, I don't just need to suck it up. Oh, this isn't just my problem. So seeing it as a larger issue, I think, can help the student as well. That they may not be able to solve that problem that they're having with that professor. Maybe the better thing for them, unfortunately, might be to just get through it. Maybe that person, isn't going to change, but there's something else for them, on the other side, for the student. So to be able to just have that perspective, I think a lot of times it's important to have that kind of outside support too. So building community however you can, and that unfortunately you might have to, search further. Fortunately, we have all these different ways of connecting now. That make it a little bit easier. So even if you can't afford to go to a conference, you can still, come to different events that are online and form connections, join, join different kinds of groups in this way.
I want to add to that, Dr. Nakamura, around how do we hold the system accountable also, right? Because the conversation we're having is like students, faculty, right, as two very distinct groups. And as you can imagine, a student has a degree of powerlessness compared to a professor. So I always think about, well, let's say I am a student who files a complaint against a professor. What is the accountability measure? Where does it go? And consequently, what sort of accountability measures are we creating within and expectations around faculty and staff in terms of how we're showing up for our students, right? Because I think community accountability is absolutely fundamental to having this conversation. I think we can't continue relying on our students to dig deep and be brave when these are folks, for many of us, are between the ages of 18 and 22. I remember what I was like at 18 to 22. I was not as vocal as I am now, right? So there's a piece around supporting our students who may be traditionally aged going through this experience, but also how do we hold the system accountable for when one or a few people show up in a particular way? What are we doing to rectify how that alter that culture that this person is ultimately reinforcing? I think the other thing, exactly what you said around what are the additional resources outside of the classroom. This is where collaborative partnership is really important, right? So in my work as a clinician, working in a college counseling setting, I was often meeting with other student-facing offices, right? Because if we couldn't necessarily get to the professor to necessarily make some changes, could these students receive support from a staff member who, again, is not in the classroom, but can do some coaching around, here's how I would suggest you approach this, or here are the other resources on campus that I may not be familiar with that you can utilize in getting some of these needs met? Because I think we have some missed opportunities around how do we continue developing these students outside of the classroom, right? And advocating for yourself is a form of development that we don't give credit to most of our staff members, not necessarily faculty members, who do a lot of this work with our students. So again, it's looking at the systemic approach and thinking, how can we strategically use the system to shift the culture?
Culture shift is definitely what we need across the board. And I'm glad that we're really tackling on this question about what students can practically do. Again, it's probably one of the most heard questions that I have when I talk about microaggressions or systemic oppression, or racial spotlighting and racial ignoring that happens in the classroom, what students can do. And you both offered such rich resources and ideas for what students can do, especially this idea of expanding the community beyond the walls of the classroom, beyond the walls of the university or college, to the local community and to the online community. Again, that's one of the other reframes I've been taking is access to not only healthcare, but to other people that may look like you, that may reflect your experiences more closely to how you experience them, which is a form of validation and affirmation, that we utilize that. And so we can look for affirmation, for validation, just by getting validation. When I experience something, I shoot a text to one of my text chats that have other folks that know me, that have the experiences that are similar, and I'm met with, yeah, that sucks, or that with belief, right? I'm met with belief, and that's what we want. We want to be believed in for what we're experiencing, as opposed to being told that, oh, you're making a bigger deal out of nothing, or that's not really what I intended to happen, or that's not what's really going on here. You know, we're often gaslit whenever we do admit these things. And so being cautious about who we talk to process these can be really important, and also getting that external validation and support, especially if our university isn't kind of up to par with offering the resources that really are needed to create that sense of belongingness that we seek out on campus. You know, in the chat, there's a really great dialogue going on, if you're able to read it, about, you know, just terminology, you know, language and intentionality with language. I think language is so important and critical. We know that, you know, words and language isn't, you know, they're not going to sit equally or the same on everyone's ears. So I think it's important that we develop, you know, a wide range of words and terms to use for even maybe the same concepts. You know, and here Gordon asked, you know, about toxic masculinity and how that it might be hard on boys to kind of hear this term as a form of sexism, and thinking of maybe we call it unhealthy masculinity or what have you. But we have to think about, well, what are these terms messages that they're sending? And we do know that masculinity can be toxic, right? It can actually create illness and sickness. And I think that's why that term is used, and it's also unhealthy, right? But I recommend using terms that resonate with your experience, but also making sure that we use terms that resonate with the experiences of those that we're working with, so that we're not inadvertently applying our, you know, our own frames and ideals for what are meant for, even like concepts like healing and seeking help, that means something different to everybody depending on where they're coming from. I'm wondering, Doctors Nakamura and Phillip, you know, I'm sure language is crucial. You both do writing and speaking, and I know that you're very kind of intentional with how you present and think about things and conceptualize them. But what are some of your ideas for, you know, language and making sure that that language is kind of honored and validated?
You know, as Therapist 101, one of the first things that I learned is that you use the language of the folks in front of you, right? So if someone describes something as toxic masculinity, I'm going to use that term, right? And just understanding the historical context of masculinity being rooted in patriarchy. The two cannot be separated. And we do know that there are forms of patriarchy that are toxic, right? So I think it's language is important, but the language that I am using is not based on my opinion or my personal feelings, but I am listening to the community and using the words that are good for them. So I think language is important, but you also have to ask yourself, who is using the language? What is the power behind this word? And then use that as your springboard to continue having these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the same response that I would give is, you know, using the language that people in front of you are using. If it makes you uncomfortable, you know, checking in with yourself about, you know, what is it about that makes me want to use a different term? You know, I might want to try to use a term to soften it, to make it seem more, you know, inclusive or more positive. And, you know, that unfortunately can be harmful to the person who's telling you kind of their experience using these terms that maybe you're not familiar with or not comfortable with. I think another issue is that, you know, a lot of the terms that we use end up getting kind of thrown back in our faces and mocked. You know, so all of a sudden, you know, toxic masculinity is this thing that, you know, now people are like, you know, lobbying against using that word, or, you know, other, you know, there's plenty of other examples about things that, you know, are kind of become the boogeyman, that the, you know, using the language, kind of pulling the curtain back or whatever and saying like, here's a thing that we should be looking at, you know, all of a sudden it gets a lot of energy gets put into, you know, like critical race theory is the one of the moment, you know, that all of a sudden this is a big problem. It's, you know, in a lot of ways a manufactured problem to get people upset. So, you know, thinking about how language is so important, and to also be suspicious when we put a lot of energy into debating terms. You know, what we should be focusing on is the larger problem, you know, that the specific word is not the larger problem, but it's what's behind there.
You're spot on. You know, I think both of you know, like my main emphasis scholarly and practically are microaggressions. And I've had that term thrown in my face since I started doing trainings on this in probably 2008, before folks even really knew what they were. And so our language can be used against us. But I think I want to highlight that point that it's really the meaning behind the language that's important. You know, we need to use terms that are appropriate for who we're working with, but maybe we ask folks, what do you think is meant by a microaggression, right? We kind of, again, that's enacting a culturally humble perspective. And that way we can kind of start to build some connections between each other and build more understanding in terms of how these issues kind of impact us. But getting into those debates can be harmful as well, right? Because that's just intellectualism. That's when we intellectualize problems. As clinicians, we know that's probably maladaptive coping mechanisms that folks use to kind of prevent themselves from really feeling and emoting what's going on. So we live in this cognitive space that can sometimes be safer, but it really isn't a safer space because it's not really honoring, again, the full person and what they're bringing to the picture. And so again, I kind of shy away from those debates because I know what they're about. It's kind of sidetracking some things, but let's go to what the meaningfulness of this is. Now, we only have a few minutes left. I'm going to ask each of you to share, a final comment, if you will, within a minute, if you can keep it, about just what do you want our young people on this call to kind of walk away with after, or I just used ableist language, I'm sorry, go away with after our conversation.
I think I'll jump right in. So ideally, we would all love to see a world where these barriers to care did not exist, right? But to do that, we have to be honest with our own part to play in reinforcing some of these systems, right? Some folks are actively working toward the goal on a larger scale through political and legal advocacy, but we can also contribute to change by shifting our practice as professionals, clinicians, whatever your discipline is, right? So this is a comment to the practitioners on the call, and then to the students, I will say, whenever you take a course of action, ask yourself, is this the only way to do this thing? What would happen if I tried operating outside of the box, especially since queer, young folk of color presenting concerns will always be considered outside the box, since our experiences were not the ones upon which many of these practices and resources were built upon and designed for, right? So instead of asking ourselves, how can we fit these folks into the systems, I want us to start asking how we can shift our practice to contribute to small and incremental systemic change. Let's redefine what systems of care entail for our younger queer and trans BIPOC siblings, because honestly, they're depending on us, especially those of us who embody some of these identities. They're looking to us to say, like, hey, I could learn from you, but I also want someone to be visible and to be on my side, because belongingness is so important for our emerging adult population. They want to see that they're not just alone in this struggle. So to the folks who are on this call who are part of those communities, you're not alone. It's just figuring out like how we can make ourselves more visible and make ourselves more accessible to you.
I think that one thing that I have been thinking about is, what would it be like for LGBTQ BIPOC folks if we weren't needing to struggle so much, if we weren't having to fight all the time? What if we had the space to thrive? What if we didn't have all of these things being thrown in front of us all of the time? And so, to your point, Dr. Rivera, about debating around the term microaggression is for, I think we are very good at surviving. We're very good at fighting like we've had to. And so, that's a strength that we have. But at the same time, I think we also need to work to be able to see where the traps are and where to not expend the energy. That, maybe that's not the fight for today. Maybe we need to preserve ourselves for something else, something bigger. Maybe we just have to let that go. And I struggle with that because, when you see an injustice, you wanna right it. But then we see so many injustices when we have multiple oppressed identities, that can keep us fighting against these things all day long. And then there's never any space, there's never any pocket of air for us to be, creative or joyful or, whatever, because we are having to put so much energy into these other things. So I think it's just, a call for all of us to take a step back and to kind of recognize that, some of these things are traps. Some of these things are not the best use of our energy. Maybe they are wrong. Maybe that person should be put in their place, but maybe that's a way for us to be depleted of something that we shouldn't give to that person. So I think it's really hard to find the balance in doing that. but really wanting us to be thinking about, what if we had the space to thrive? How do we create those pockets for ourselves?
Just want to reiterate that, Dr. Nakamura, what if we had this space to thrive, right? Maybe we can even pretend in a way that we do in our own circles and our own, I think we actually do that, right? That there are pockets where we do feel like we can thrive without, the interference of the oppression that has created these barriers that we've had to navigate and learn to navigate in many ways. But how can we kind of just reconnect with ourselves, reconnect with our own values, right? Kind of reshape those horrible norms and values out there that have created, a lot of the oppressions that we experience. So what can we do? And I think that starts with kind of acknowledging your assets and your strengths on a regular basis, as I mentioned before. And I encourage us all to do that with each other, openly, loudly, and very vocally. I want to thank both of you, Dr. Nakamura, Dr. Phillip, for taking time out of your busy schedules to share your brilliance with everyone. And thank you all for being here. I want to now turn this over to my colleague from the STEE Fund, Laura Sanchez-Parkinson, Director of Program Partnerships, going to share some more opportunities that we have with the STEE Fund to kind of continue our engagement.
Thank you so much, David. And on behalf of the STEE Fund, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you would like to further engage with the STEE Fund through our programs, our services, our resources, we invite you to visit our website at thesteefund.org. And we also invite you to look out for the next community conversation. So we'll see you next time. Thank you.